Chimera Shadow Garden. Chimera Shadow Garden is Megumi Fushiguro's domain expansion, and it is the only domain in the series that is openly acknowledged to be incomplete. Rather than building a fully enclosed barrier environment, the domain floods the surrounding area with thick fluid shadows that take over the entire space, recoloring everything into a negative visual palette. Inside the domain, Megumi gains the ability to manifest multiple Shikigami simultaneously and manipulate all available shadows with enhanced precision. Anyone standing within the domain needs to reinforce their feet with cursed energy or risk sinking into the shadows, and if someone falls into them, there is no buoyancy, no resistance, and no oxygen. You just fall indefinitely. Because the barrier is incomplete, Megumi can only activate this domain inside an already enclosed space, using the existing walls as a substitute for the barrier he cannot yet generate on his own. He first manifested against a finger bearer, using a combination of Shikigami and shadow clones to win a fight he otherwise could not have. He later uses it during Shibuya to cancel out the sure hit effect of Dagon's domain and create an exit point for the trapped sorcerers. In the culling game, he forcibly encloses it inside a gymnasium to trap Reggistar inside, and even without a completed guaranteed hit, the domain amplifies the 10 Shadows technique to 120% of its normal output. Reggie ends up using Megumi's own shadows against him by dropping summon vehicles into the domain, exploiting the rule that the user feels the weight of everything stored inside it. Megumi's completed domain has not appeared yet, and based on what the incomplete version already does, the ceiling on this one is genuinely unknown. Self-Embodiment of Perfection. Self-Embodiment of Perfection is the domain expansion of Mahito, and the environment it produces is a large dark space where the target is surrounded by enormous hands clasped together in a flower-like arrangement, with additional arms branching out from them to form a net pattern that closes in around whoever is caught inside. The guaranteed hit of this domain enhances the precision and effectiveness of Mahito's idol transfiguration, his ability to reshape souls. Inside the domain, he no longer needs to make physical contact with a target to transfigure their soul, which removes the biggest limitation his technique normally has. It's first used against Nanami and Yuji, and right before the sure hit can kill Nanami, Yuji physically breaks into the domain from the outside. Because the domain automatically connects to the souls of everyone inside it, Sukuna becomes aware of what's happening and retaliates against Mahito from within Yuji's soul, which causes the domain to shatter. Mahito later uses it against Kokichi Muta, who counters it with simple domain to nullify the sure hit effect. After watching Gojo use his domain for a compressed 2-second burst, Mahito learns to do the same thing, using an extremely short activation to hit Yuji and Aoi Todo without giving Sukuna enough time to react. That brief use transfigures Todo's arm, which Todo cuts off himself before it can spread. Authentic Mutual Love. Authentic Mutual Love is the domain expansion of Yuta Okotsu, and the environment it creates looks like a collapsed landscape scattered with the wreckage of cross-shaped structures, with katanas embedded in the ground throughout the entire space. The way the domain's sure hit works is different from almost every other domain in the series. Yuta selects one previously copied curse technique to embed into the domain's barrier as the guaranteed hit, and the effect of that hit changes entirely depending on which technique he chooses. Every other cursed technique he has ever copied is then randomly distributed across the katanas scattered throughout the environment. Yuta himself doesn't know which technique is in which sword until he actually grabs it, and each sword is destroyed after a single use, but the domain contains an unlimited number of them. This makes Yuta's domain an unpredictable and constantly shifting arsenal during a fight. He first attempts to use it against Ryu, Ishigori, and Kururushi, but their overlapping domains and the interference of Kururushi cause all three to collapse before fully forming. The domain is fully displayed during his fight with Sukuna, where Yuta embeds Angel's technique Extinguishment into the barrier as the sure hit, forcing Sukuna to maintain Hollow Wicker Basket at all times, just to neutralize the effect. With half of Sukuna's arms and mouths occupied with that countermeasure, Yuta presses the advantage using his stockpile of stolen techniques to keep Sukuna under constant pressure. The domain eventually shatters after Sukuna lands a world-cutting slash on Yuta, but the fact that a single sorcerer pushed Sukuna into that kind of defensive posture through domain mechanics alone says a great deal about where Yuta sits in the current power structure of the series. Malevolent Shrine. Malevolent Shrine is the domain expansion of Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, and it is one of the most destructive domains in the entire series, where most domain expansions build an enclosed environment that traps the target inside a barrier. Malevolent Shrine does something completely different. Sukuna expands it without closing off the barrier, which means there is no enclosed shell containing it. Instead, the domain manifests openly into the surrounding space, centered around a small, disfigured Buddhist shrine with 4 enormous, grotesque mouths serving as its entrances, complete with human-like teeth and tongues. Because Sukuna opens the domain without a barrier, he enters a binding vow that allows the target an escape route, but in exchange extends the effective range of the guaranteed hit up to nearly 200 meters in every direction. The sure hit effect of this domain unleashes Sukuna's 2 signature slashing attacks, Cleave and Dismantle, relentlessly and automatically across everything within that range. Dismantle handles inanimate objects, and Cleave handles anything with cursed energy, and neither stops until the domain is canceled or Sukuna is too injured to sustain it. The first time we see this domain is when Sukuna was in his 2-finger form and used it briefly to kill a finger bearer and reclaim the finger inside it. The true scale of it doesn't become clear until Shibuya, where Sukuna opens it inside a populated district, and it tears through entire city blocks and kills hundreds of people in moments. Later in his battle with Gojo, it's revealed that Sukuna can alter the conditions of the domain mid-use, including narrowing its range to concentrate its output. And after losing access to the domain and then regaining it through consecutive black flashes, the domain comes back in a new form that can only be sustained for 99 seconds. Even with that time limit, 99 seconds of Malevolent Shrine is more than enough to end most fights entirely. Infinite Void. Infinite Void is the domain expansion of Satoru Gojo and later Kenjaku. After he takes over Gojo's body, the environment it creates brings whoever is inside into the limitless technique itself, which means the setting is an endless void that visually resembles outer space, complete with a large black hole, distant galaxies, and scattered patches of white light throughout the background. The guaranteed hit of this domain floods the target's mind with infinite raw information simultaneously. The human brain simply cannot process everything at once, and the result is complete immobilization. The target can see and feel everything all at the same time, which overstimulates the senses to the point where voluntary movement becomes impossible. The effect doesn't apply to Gojo or anyone he is physically touching at the time of expansion, which means a clever opponent could theoretically grab onto Gojo the moment he activates it and use that contact to stay immune. During Shibuya, Gojo activates Infinite Void for only 2 seconds against a large crowd to incapacitate them temporarily without causing permanent brain damage, flooding their minds with roughly 6 months worth of information. In his fight with Sukuna, Gojo demonstrates that he can expand and compress the domain, even reducing it to the size of a basketball, and he reinforces the outer shell of the domain to be stronger than the inner layer in order to withstand the constant slashing output of Malevolent Shrine from the outside. Briefly after Kenjaku takes over Gojo's body, Yuta also uses this domain in a short exchange against a reincarnated Sukuna. Coffin of the Iron Fortress. Coffin of the Iron Fortress is the domain expansion belonging to Jogo, one of the 4 disaster curses. The environment it creates looks exactly like what the name suggests, a sealed stone chamber built into the inside of an active volcano. The walls are cracked open with fissures, magma is seeping through the floor, and the ambient heat inside the domain is so extreme that the average Jujutsu sorcerer would simply combust the moment they enter. That alone makes it dangerous before the sure hit even comes into play. The guaranteed hit of this domain gives Jogo command over the environment itself, meaning he can direct the molten rock to strike his target with an attack that cannot miss. The only time we see this domain used is against Satoru Gojo during the Shibuya incident, and Jogo couldn't land a single point of damage on him because of how Limitless works. Gojo's barrier simply overwhelmed it, but that result shouldn't make you underestimate this domain because Gojo is the single worst possible matchup for it. Against essentially anyone else in the series, stepping inside Coffin of the Iron Fortress is pretty much a death sentence. Deadly Sentencing. Deadly Sentencing is the domain expansion used by Hiromi Higuruma, and it functions completely differently from every other domain on this list. This domain does not create a lethal environment, and it does not have a conventional sure-hit attack. Instead, it manifests a small courtroom where Higuruma acts as the prosecutor, and the target becomes the defendant, with a Shikigami called Judge Man presiding over the proceedings. Judge Man has complete knowledge of everything about every person inside the domain, and he uses that information to level charges against the defendant based on crimes they may or may not have actually committed. The binding vow built into the domain requires Higuruma to explain the rules to whoever is inside, and once the trial begins, neither side is allowed to use violence. The defendant gets one opportunity to respond to the charges and can choose to stay silent, confess, confess or deny. The prosecutor gets one chance to present evidence that Judge Man provides in the form of a sealed envelope. Judge Man then delivers a verdict based purely on the arguments made. If the defendant is found guilty, they receive a sentence, with one of the most common being confiscation, which strips the guilty party of their ability to use their cursed technique entirely. A guilty defendant who did not confess can demand a retrial that Judge Man cannot refuse. This domain is used on Yuji, who demands a retrial after being found guilty and having his cursed energy confiscated. And during that retrial, he is found guilty of mass murder due to the events of Shibuya, while Sukuna had control of his body. That verdict grants Higuruma the Executioner's Sword, a blade of pure cursed energy that kills anything it touches instantly. Higuruma later uses this domain against Sukuna during the all-out battle, using it to confiscate Sukuna's cursed tool and push for a death sentence. Horizon of the Captivating Scandal. Horizon of the Captivating Scandal is the domain expansion used by Dagon, one of the disaster curses, and it stands out visually from most domains in the series. The environment it creates is a tropical beach with a dense forest of palm trees on one side and an infinite ocean stretching out on the other. The sure-hit effect of this domain manifests Dagon's aquatic shikigami directly onto the target's body, meaning the fish don't travel toward the target from a distance. They simply appear at the point of contact the moment they are generated, making them nearly impossible to block or react to because they do not exist until they are already hitting you. Dagon originally used this domain during his Cursed Womb stage primarily as a base of operations for the disaster curses rather than as an offensive tool. The full lethality of it is not shown until he deploys it against Nanami, Naobito, and Maki during the Shibuya incident, where all three of them are completely overwhelmed by the endless barrage of fish shikigami with no way to stop it. The situation doesn't shift until Megumi forces his way in and creates an exit point through his own technique, and then Toji Fushiguro enters through that opening and takes Dagon apart completely, collapsing the domain with him. Time Cell Moon Palace. Time Cell Moon Palace is the domain expansion of Naoya Zenin, and it exists in a slightly unusual context because Naoya uses it after becoming a vengeful spirit rather than as a living sorcerer. The environment is a mostly empty black space with only a few floating particles and a central stage as the main visual element. The stage itself is a straight path of flesh leading toward a large disembodied eye behind the caster. The sure hit of this domain injects strips of animated film directly into the neck of each target, and from that point, anyone who moves inside the domain must conform perfectly to the 24 frames per second rule that governs Naoya's projection sorcery technique. Any movement that doesn't divide cleanly into those 24 frames causes the body to suffer countless small cuts and lacerations with every motion, and forcing a movement through the domain's restriction can sever a limb entirely. Naoya uses this domain while fighting Maki, Daido, and Mio. He traps Daido and Mio inside it and injects the film into both of them. When nothing visually obvious happens immediately, they assume it misfired and try to attack him, at which point their bodies are torn up by their own movement. The one person the domain genuinely cannot account for is Maki, whose complete lack of cursed energy means the domain's targeting system cannot register her at all. She moves freely through it and kills Noya from behind before he can adjust. Idle Death Gamble. Idle Death Gamble is the domain expansion of Kinji Hikari, and the full name of this domain is Idle Death Gamble Pachinko CR Private Pure Love Train version 1 out of 239. The environment and mechanics of this domain are built entirely around a real pachinko machine themed after an in-universe romance manga called Private Pure Love Train. The sure hit effect of the domain transfers all the rules of the game directly into the opponent's mind, and the objective for Hikari is to hit the jackpot by lining up 3 matching symbols. The odds of hitting the jackpot are 1 in 239. If he hits it, Hikari receives unlimited cursed energy and a fully automatic reverse curse technique for exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which is the duration of the Private Pure Love Train theme song. The regeneration speed granted during the jackpot period is faster than even Gojo and Sukuna. During normal mode, Hikari can manifest visual indicators in battle, including shutter doors, reverse balls, and consecutive effects, each with different colors representing rarity and chances of progressing toward the jackpot. Getting into a reach scenario reveals 2 of the 3 symbols needed and dramatically increases the jackpot probability, with the final train reach scenario sitting at over 80%. The domain itself activates in under 2 seconds, which is exceptionally fast. Hikari uses this domain against Charles Bernard and then Hajime Kashimo, and his mastery over the game is clear from how consistently he hits the jackpot at a rate that goes well beyond the stated odds. Threefold Affliction. Threefold Affliction is the domain expansion of Yozu, an ancient sorcerer reincarnated during the culling game. The environment it generates is a mostly blank space populated by large floating organic structures that resemble the disembodied brains and ventral nerve cords of insects. The sure hit of this domain applies directly to Yozu's constructed objects rather than to the opponent's body, guaranteeing that whatever she builds inside the domain makes contact with her target. She uses it near the end of her battle with Sukuna, opening the domain immediately after constructing her most powerful weapon, the True Sphere, in order to guarantee that the sphere reaches the King of Curses. She hesitates at the moment of activation, and Sukuna counters by summoning Maharaga, whose Sword of Extinguishment shatters the True Sphere entirely. Maharaga then strikes Yozu down, and the domain collapses with her. Womb Profusion. Womb Profusion is the domain expansion associated with Kenjaku, though there is some suggestion within the story that this technique may have originally belonged to Kori Itadori before Kenjaku took over her body. The domain creates a towering totem pole-like structure of fused, grotesque, spirit-like faces stacked on top of one another, and its sure hit delivers an explosive, invisible force to anyone caught within its effective range. The specific nature of what the force actually is remains deliberately unclear. Like Malevolent Shrine, this domain is expanded without closing a barrier, meaning it manifests directly into the surrounding airspace with no defined outer shell. Kenjaku uses this during his battle with Yuki Tsukumo, timing the expansion to take advantage of Yuki's hesitation to open her own domain. Without a shell to target, Tengen struggles to dismantle it, and Womb Profusion's guaranteed hit lands on Yuki with a wave of intense force that leaves her severely injured.